All right, my friends, it is 9 minutes after the top of the hour. If you can hear my voice, start making your way back to your computers because we are going to get started in just a minute. We have already started streaming back onto YouTube. As a reminder, you can watch any of these back, keynote, session 1, session 2, as well as this third session. You can watch it back on demand on Safe Cultural Heritage Group's YouTube channel. Just like with the other sessions, you're welcome to put your comments or questions in the chat. And if you've not already put your name and email in the chat to get a certificate of completion, please do so before the end of this third session. On this International Archaeology Day, we are super happy to have a third session. First one, we had a keynote that you can watch. Session 1 was about archaeology of the heart. Session 2 was about artificial intelligence and cultural heritage. And then this third session is about nature, culture, and museums. I do want to say that the same theme, nature, culture, and museums, as well as artists and galleries, is always the focal point of Museum Week. Museum Week is celebrated annually in early June. So be on the lookout for that for the 2025 dates and themes. Museum Week is one of the co-sponsors of this session as well. Again, my name is Katie. I am the founder of Learner-Centered Strategies. So I am currently sitting in a hotel room in Connecticut. However, I typically work in Oregon. I'm on the East Coast for some travels, and we've had panelists from all over the world talking already today. And with this session, I will be moderating, but ultimately, Avi and I are going to have a conversation. I'm really looking forward to hearing what your insights are. I do want to read Avi's bio before we kick off. So the approach here is museums, nature, and culture in a changing world. Avi Dekter's journey in the museum world has been shaped by his passion for history, education, and community engagement. Educated at esteemed institutions such as Columbia University, the London School of Economics, and Brandeis University, Avi brings a depth of knowledge and expertise to his work. As managing partner of History Now, Avi has led the development of impactful programs and exhibits that tackle difficult topics like labor unrest, war, and social justice. His experience spans senior roles at the National Museum of American History and the H.F. Winterthur Museum and Gardens, as well as collaborations with diverse museums and historical sites. Avi's writing and editing endeavors have resulted in significant publications, including Change is Required, Preparing for the Post-Pandemic Museum in 2016, and Exploring American Jewish History Through 50 Historic Treasures in 2024. He continues to explore new ways to make museums more inclusive and relevant, hosting talking circles and forums that foster dialogue and innovation. So Avi, thank you for joining us today. I appreciate your time on a Saturday. I would love, if you'd like to add anything. I know you've got some 10 theses we'll kick off with, but anything you'd like to share or add?
No, I just think that we should all be aware that not only is our Earth system changing as we sit here speaking, but the very paradigm of museums is changing as well. So museums have a double challenge before they even start to think about how to resolve the problem. And as we all know, most of us are pretty change resistant. Pretty stubborn in our habits, and adapting to novelty under any circumstance is a challenge for people and for institutions. So museums have their work cut out for them for the next decade or two.
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking about this morning. So both of us being in the U.S., We've got a presidential election coming up, and that we could talk for hours about how museums address just that one moment of our history. I would love to hear these. You said it was 10 theses to think about to kick this off.
Yeah, I had many years ago a colleague, Ken Ames, at the Winterthur Museum, laid up 10 theses about material culture studies, and I was very impressed. And I have used that format, not necessarily 10, but of nailing some theses to the wall to get conversation started. So whenever you're ready, I'm ready.
Yeah, let's do it. That sounds great.
Okay. Well, the book of Ecclesiastes opens up with the following statement. One generation goes, another comes, but the earth remains the same forever. Now, if there is one thing that we know today, is that that is not a true statement of fact. So here go 10 theses about nature and culture. Some of them should be very obvious, apparent to every one of us who are on the call today. And I repeat them because, frankly, there is no end of the need for repetition of some of these basic ideas. So number one, the world has entered the Anthropocene, a new age of human disruption of climates, environments, and ecosystems. The Anthropocene is the term for our current geological age, viewed as the period during which human activity has been the dominant influence on climate and the environment. Humankind are literally, for the first time, capable of interrupting the balance of nature and altering the course of Earth history, which of course makes Homo sapiens responsible for acting to preserve a viable Earth system for our own survival as a species. 2, human-induced global warming and climate change are real. This brooks no discussion. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change recently reported that climate change is widespread, rapid, and intensifying, and that some trends are now irreversible. Many changes are unprecedented. Temperatures are rising, so are sea levels, drought, floods, wildfires, and other destructive events proliferate, and the evidence for this is absolutely irrefutable. 3, environmental degradation affects all parts of the Earth system. The Earth system is itself an integrated system divided into 4 main components: the geosphere, atmosphere, hydrosphere, and biosphere. And these components are also systems in their own right and are tightly interconnected. Changes in our atmosphere have been foregrounded in recent discussions, but the hydrosphere as well has suffered enormous changes. These include the Earth's oceans and seas, its ice sheets, sea ice and glaciers, its lakes, rivers, and streams, its atmospheric moisture and ice crystals, and areas of permafrost. But we are also becoming cognizant of radical changes in our biosphere, which is leading to destruction of species, threatening the production of crops, and a host of other ills. 4, everyone, all of us, there's no they in this one, all of us participate in environmental degradation on a daily basis. We drive gas-powered cars and fly on airplanes. Our homes are built of environmental unfriendly materials and are rarely designed for maximum efficiency. The air that keeps us cool, the refrigerators and freezers that preserve our food, the diets we enjoy, the clothing we wear, and even the way we brush our teeth all affect the environment. Rabbi Nina Beth Cardin, an environmental leader in Baltimore, remarked, "We hold the world at the end of our fork," and she wasn't kidding. In turn, of course, the degraded environment affects many aspects of our daily lives, from smog and air pollution to rising insurance rates for our homes and the costs of healthcare. 5, Environmental justice and social justice are linked to one another. According to Emlyn Koster and others, until now it has been possible for many people to assume that societal health is separate from and superior to environmental health. This form of denial has fostered impressions that nature and culture are unconnected realms. Instead, our government, for-profit enterprises, and nonprofit organizations need to adopt a new paradigm that recognizes the connections between societies and environments. The Rockefeller Foundation and the medical journal Lancet recently concluded that the health of human civilization depends in part, in large measure, on the health of natural systems. Environmental justice and social justice are not only pervasive concerns, they are conjoined imperatives. 6, our response to climate change and environmental degradation is informed by the Judeo-Christian worldview, especially as it is presented in the Bible. There is a tension in the Bible between human-centric and ecocentric perspectives. On the one hand, mankind is charged with dominion of the natural world, the view that has been the norm for millennia. But on the other hand, the Bible also charges humankind with care of the natural world. These tensions are not yet resolved and are still guiding our practices today on an everyday basis. 7, our institutions need to make themselves more eco-friendly. All of our museum structures, from our choice of cleaning solvents to the kinds of snacks we offer visitors, from the temperatures we set on our thermostats to the ways we use our grounds, affect our environment. If we have not already done so, it is now time to engage, organize, and mobilize our lay and professional leaders, our staffs and volunteers, our donors, and even our visitors in looking for ways to improve the environmental footprint of our own institutions. Rachel Kushner, the author of a new novel, Creation Lake, says, "We are, like it or not, ourselves Homo sapiens, a figure who we can all agree has found himself in crisis, a man whose death drive is in the driver's seat." That's a kind of ominous formulation that I have to live with, for sure. Point 8. To do so, we need next narratives. The conventional stories we tell ourselves are not adequate to meet the crisis. We need narratives that explicitly and directly link nature and culture at the local level, that is the immediate level. Let me give an instance. Many local museums interpret one or another natural disaster. A flood, a tornado, a snowstorm, a wildfire, fire, a drought. If we look closely at these natural catastrophes, we can see that they describe not only the natural disaster, but also its social consequences. Who survived and who did not, and why? Who received attention and who did not? In the preparation for disaster and its aftermath, whose lives were defined as part of the community of concern and who were not. When we look at these natural disasters incisively, the natural and social are bound up with each other. Our next narratives must make this linkage clear. 9, as we educate ourselves about our own impacts on the environment, we are also obliged to inform and educate our visitors and users. From the moment of first encounter, whether at our reception desk or our home page, we need to call out environmental degradation as an issue and a challenge, and to explain some of the steps we, our museums, are taking to protect the Earth system. Continued silence and willful ignorance are not options for museums anymore. Even if we go no further than to tweak the awareness of our constituents, we are taking important action. Consciousness raising has been a critical first step in making change up to and including the new awareness of DEAI issues in our workplace. And 10, As integral parts of our communities and as socially conscious organizations, we need to respond now and forever after to the red alert published by the IPCC. If we can respond actively to Black Lives Matter and the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others, then we can take steps to protect our common home. In the long run, failing to do so will help to make the past century's genocides look like mere blips in the graph of mass destruction. It will expose our moral bankruptcy, and it will render us and our museums deservedly irrelevant to the critical challenge of our times. So,
Those are beautiful. Is that like posted anywhere that we could like link to it?
no, unfortunately, but I can offer a suggested reading for everybody's attention. It is really pretty critical stuff, and that is Emlyn Koster, who has directed 3 major science museums in North America, published an article called Paradigm Shift in Exhibition Magazine in spring 2021. And I recommend the article to everybody. Emlyn is both a scientist and a humanist scholar, and he has been dedicating recent years to linking the two, one to the other. I've taken lessons at his knee. I recommend that you pick up on his bibliography, but this is a great place to start because you don't have to know a great deal of science to understand the basics that he's laying out there and why they are so critical for cultural and social interpretation as well as natural interpretation or environmental interpretation.
Yeah, real briefly, anyone who's listening, at least on Zoom, I'd love just either in the chat or in the reaction button, do these 10 points resonate with where you are geographically? Because I know when I was listening, there are certain things happening in the United States that it immediately evoked, especially when you called out Black Lives Matter and the killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, that those are, and there's, you know, a lot of other things that came to mind, but I'm curious if anybody listening, if those 10 points resonated in one way or another with where you are.
One of the things that we do know, of course, is that the crisis is global. And it may manifest slightly differently in each locale, but in point of fact, it's very clear that the consequences of global warming are going to be global, and they are already occurring. It's not something we're waiting to have happen. It's already happening.
Yes, absolutely true. I typically, in the last, most of my life, minus like 5 years, I've lived in coastal communities. And so the hurricane preparation and tsunami preparation and then wildfires and earthquakes, it's like all these natural disasters that you, at least from where I went to school, you had drills for since you were little. And it's just somewhat normal and expected to have these. And it's interesting to me that people still then debate about global warming. I'm curious if you've had that experience too, Avi, if that's something that, like, do you get debated on this? Or is that just like my experience?
I think that I'm a child of privileged circumstances. Most of the people that I'm involved with actually engage with me on a volunteer basis. No one's actually holding a gun to their head and making them join me in conversation. And as a result, I live in the same kind of echo chamber as everybody else in the world. That is, you're most often in conversation with people who think like you, who have had the same educational backgrounds, who take certain assumptions for granted. But in point of fact, one of the things that's striking is that even people who appear to be in denial of climate change and global warming very often will concede a good number of points about how things are really changing, but they're not willing to buy the consequences or the implications of those changes. And that's the place where I think we differ most with each other in responding to climate change. It's not that everybody's sitting there saying, oh my God, it's not getting warmer out there. I mean, that's just factual, and anybody living in today's world will recognize and acknowledge that. The problem is a slightly different one. Okay, so what? What caused it? Well, some people are in denial about human agency in that. Other people are in denial about the efficacy of human intervention. So, pays your money, takes your chances.
Yeah, I think the point you make about people will concede, I I've thought about this often in my realm. I focus so much on accessibility and inclusion, and it's almost like people have an aversion to the technical terms, but when you remove those technical terms, or like I've been told politically charged terms, that if you remove those and talk about what you're working towards, people don't have a problem with that. But for whatever reason, society or certain, just people have those words are very triggering for them. And it sounds like something similar with the global warming side, right? Like they'll concede, they'll say like, oh yes, this is something that's happening. But if you put the label on it, they start to get squirrely.
I think you're right that first of all, in general, when we speak the vernacular, we generally communicate more effectively. As soon as we introduce any kind of jargon, we're immediately starting to draw lines between one group and another. And it's not a very healthy way to do business. We're privileged because both of us live in North America and we are native speakers of English. And English happens to be the richest single language in the history of the world. It has the largest vocabulary, and it's marvelously flexible. And you can always find. I mean, I just love Rachel Kushner's thing. We're in the driver's seat in a death car. Well, that'll communicate urgency if nothing else does. But what we need is we often are lacking both vernacular on the one hand, and on the other hand, poetry. I know that sounds odd, but in point of fact, poetry distills and intensifies the meaning of language and its power. And for me, one of the things that museums can do and do very infrequently is to raise the vernacular of everyday life to the level of poetry. When you run into an exhibition where somebody actually knew how to do that in their label writing, for example, they quote just the right person, everybody responds to it without exception. But it's a high art, and it takes a tremendous amount of attention to make that happen. And very often, two devices seem to me to work very well. One is to start with a question. It's actually in English, of course, or whatever vernacular, because the question does not necessarily presume an answer, that is, if it's truly open-ended. And the other is to find yourself a drop-dead quote that takes it out of the realm of some expert out there throwing the ideas at you, and instead provides an opportunity for the individual to respond to another human being. And believe it or not, even people with whom we disagree very strongly on some very basic issues are actually still people. Hard to believe sometimes, but that's really
It's so
true.
interesting. Every session today has brought back up and centered around human emotions. Every single session has brought it back to like what you feel and like connecting on a human level. And I've got to say that's beautiful because it's not there. It is such a charged world. And like I said, we've got for the US, we've got a presidential election, we've got hot topics like climate change and DEAI and Black Lives Matter that um, when you get to that like that heart of the person of the topic, it can be very moving. And like you said, there have been exhibits I've walked into and you just are overwhelmed with the amount of emotion and to think about like a person or a group of people created this specifically, probably, right, to evoke that emotion, to share that story in such a powerful way. It really is an art form, to me at least, right? Like being a museum person, I'm like, I have been known to be moved to tears like in a gallery, because it's like, wow, like blows my mind what people can do with some like inanimate objects, right? Like just stuff, what it boils down to.
I know that feeling. I make a habit of attending craft shows from time to time. And one of the things that's just extraordinary, it actually brings me to tears on a pretty regular basis. I'm an old softie. And one of the things that's exciting to me in going to craft shows is you will see 10 or 15 different craftspeople working with identical materials, and they come up with solutions that are just totally different one from another. The sheer creativity of it is just an astonishment every time. Uh, I think that in general, museum people have had a rough time embracing the idea that if you open up the heart, then the mind will at least open itself to consideration. Whereas preaching at people is not necessarily the best way to get results. I embrace preaching primarily for provocation. Uh, uh, there is a famous interpreter at the National Park System who once said, interpretation is provocation. And I've taken that to heart ever since. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it just meets with pure, unadulterated resistance, and you have to go back and start over again. But the reality is that all of us have grown up in systems of belief in a particular locale. And those systems of belief shape our beliefs. And it is a real rarity when, as we age, that our fundamental beliefs modify. It does happen. But that kind of transformation or conversion experience is usually a very slow and partial process at best. Most of us really stay true to the belief systems in which we were raised. And makes for a real difficulty in adapting to change. By the way, institutions share that DNA, unfortunately, and they stay pretty close to where they started out too, whenever they can. If they can do anything other than change, they will take that course.
Yeah, I want to loop Max into this conversation, as she's got her camera on. And Max, I don't have a bio for you, I don't think, to read off, which I apologize. We all know Max. Max is fabulously wonderful and arranging all of these things and in the background of these sessions. I'd love to get your thoughts as an archaeologist. Um, are the like in your realm, is this a discussion that you're having, right? Abby and I are in museums, in museum work and adjacent work. Are the same conversations about climate change and like social justice movements? Are those themes coming up in what you're seeing in your profession?
Um, yeah, certainly. They certainly are. In large part, there's also the discussion about the decolonization of archaeology, but also just a lot of the theoretical approaches to archaeology have had to shift our kind of there's the general themes of kind of Orientalist approaches or kind of more even like we had a wonderful discussion about the subaltern, like these kinds of concepts of the other and who actually is determining what is the conventional knowledge. And so for me personally, I work in Saudi Arabia. That's my area of study. And I think that especially I've noticed, as I was obviously a Westerner, as someone who is not a native Arabic speaker, it is something that kind of even just the idea of the periphery, the peripheral, like the margins of what is civilization, what isn't, what is even just our concepts of mobility versus sedentism, like these kinds of ideas of what constitutes kind of the trajectories of human development and human evolution, and what we see as being the kind of lesser, the kind of earlier, the primitive, etc. These ideas have had to shift because even just every day we are coming to terms with it, just the realities of things happening kind of not so much in a continuum. These aren't linear kind of going in different directions. These are parallel things that are happening. These are people living just different life ways, having different modes of existence in parallel to one another, not one being not being in a hierarchy. For one, for two, climate change absolutely is becoming much more of an issue just in terms of site preservation. Our understanding of how sites have evolved. So climate change throughout history and human response to climate change, but also how anthropogenic climate change of recent years is affecting the way that we interpret these sites and whether or not we are actually getting at the information from these sites and what we can glean from them is also being affected. I actually was something that Avi said was something really that I've been thinking about, that you guys have been discussing, is the fact that even museum spaces, so archaeological material ends up in museum spaces, and to some capacity, these fantastic displays, or we kind of have these fantastic exhibitions, or these materials get shipped all over the world, and it's fascinating because particularly in my line of work, like what I study specifically is human responses to like human environmental interactions, and a large part of that is climate change response, climate change's response um, throughout time. And it's really fascinating that unfortunately, in part, archaeological material becomes kind of uh, a tool of not so much dissemination, but like as in disseminating these ideas and then shipping these items across the world to even display them becomes part of the problem of even in minute ways. And how we display them, how do we even preserve these items? They have to be in climate controlled spaces. Like archaeological labs have to be climate controlled in certain ways. The technology that we use is certainly incredibly energy intensive. Um, these are conversations. I think this end of the conversation, I think, is very, it's kind of lower level in the sense of like we are having these conversations that are kind of more put in independent and personal level. But I think that we are having to come to terms with this, and even just as archaeologists, as we interact with museum spaces and gallery spaces, um, how we manage objects in like as in terms of preservation, and like what we're trying to communicate to the public about how people have responded to climate change and environmental changes through time. How are we doing that with the objects that we are actually moving around the world in ways that are not sustainable, and how are we keeping them in ways that aren't sustainable, but also how can we actually sustainably even preserve the site themselves, like itself. It is, I think it's an emerging discussion, and I think it's an important discussion to start having. And I think that in archaeology, even just having greater conversations about modern climate change and how that affects our praxis is yeah, certainly emerging.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I've never once actually sat there and thought about like things for exhibits being shipped and like that environmental impact. Um, and like installing exhibits, and you need like 4 truckloads of stuff, and we've got all these people and this much trash, and that's really interesting. It definitely, when you frame it that way, it's like you're not teaching, right? Like, what are you actually teaching when people come to museums? It's not just the stories on display, or it's not just the objects, but like the life of the objects, right? How do you run a museum? Because it's like behind this like fancy curtain that like people don't know how museums operate, which is super fun to talk about, but it's like you're doing a disservice if you don't have those conversations at your like front entrance. Abby, did you want to add any thoughts or comments in
Well,
response?
I think coping with environmental disjunction or disruption is not happening for the first and only time in human history. One of the things that archaeologists teach us is that whole societies have been disrupted because, in one way or another, their way of life was unsustainable in the locale in which they were operating. They had exhausted the soil, or they had exhausted the water supply, or they exhausted the timber supply, and basically their societies and their cultures either had to shift grounds, transform, or disappear. And archaeologists can point to that again and again happening in every part of the world, where whole societies have had to, or basically have either gone extinct or have evolved into something quite different because of the pressures that they have put on their local environments. And that is going on globally today in every part of the world. So archaeology, one nice thing about studying history is that everything, without exception, has a history. And environmental crisis is no exception to that rule. It has a history, and it has many local variants in over many millennia. So archaeologists, paleontologists, historians, material culture specialists can all help guide us to some of those stories of other environmental crises that have already occurred in the past, how people reacted to them, what worked and what didn't work. And I mean, in some cases, people found ways around, workarounds. But in a lot of cases, they were either forced to migrate or give up the way in which they had been living and find a new way of living. Really a complicated business. And of course, the great transformation of human history was the transformation from hunting gathering to agriculture with fixed abodes. That's a change in lifestyle, partly in response to environmental opportunity. But then you end up with places in the world like we have today where monocultures are failing. Agriculture at its peak performance is now failing. So what happens now? And all these things involve issues of choice about who counts, who matters, who wins, who loses, who's exploited, who gains. And therefore it ties us right back into issues of social justice.
Yeah,
By the way,
and Abby, that's exactly where.
You can't talk about social justice, by the way, anymore without invoking environmental justice as well. I hate to say it.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's kind of where my brain was going too, is what is the responsibility of a museum or an archaeological site or the professionals in those jobs to tell the stories, whether it's good, whether it's bad, whether it's ugly, like what, as a organization or as an entity, like where, like, is there a line that, like, oh, we shouldn't talk about this, or like, or should we, right? Like it's not like a legal responsibility, but like what's maybe our ethical or our integrity to share like the whole truth.
Well, I mean, the harsh reality for us is that none of our institutions is doing very well at telling, total truths, even yet and now. But in point of fact, if you look at the mission statements of almost any museum, large or small, of almost any type, there's some acceptance of responsibility to tell stories that are relevant and meaningful for the community of service. And today, I think there is no argument to be had that environmental crisis and global warming are the most critical crisis that we as a species and the Earth systems itself face. I mean, there are an awful lot of important issues in the world. I get riled up about a whole slew of them. I could give you on my laundry list. It probably would, you smile now, but I feel a little gray cloud over my head, and I feel the rain coming down. But the harsh reality that all of those concerns are superseded by this global concern that is inescapable. I mean, we're far from establishing a viable colony on Mars or even the moon. So this is the one place we got. And if we destroy the one home that we have that's actually viable, we're dead. The business of, we used to worry that the cockroaches would be the only survivors of nuclear war. And now, I mean, the harsh reality is there are going to be a whole slew of species that survive, but people aren't one of them. So I sit there and I think it doesn't matter. I mean, from where I sit, and I'm just bold about all of this, it doesn't matter what kind of museum you are, or what audience you're serving, or how large you are, or how little money or how much money you have to spend. If you are not now talking at some level about climate change and global warming, then you're an irresponsible institution and irrelevant. And the easiest ones in the world, of course, are arboreta and gardens, which are themselves of nature, but it's nature shaped by and understood in cultural terms. If for that matter, all the science that we have is nature understood through the lens of culture. If we didn't have a language to describe it, we wouldn't be able to talk about it at all. The language we use is culture. So if you start with gardens and arboreta, or natural parklands, that gives you a great starting point. Natural history museums, it's just so obvious. It's made to order for natural history museums, many of which, by the way, also talk about indigenous peoples and their lives, so they can link nature and culture in a very direct and positive way. It's certainly true for history museums. Children's museums are an absolute cinch. I mean, it goes down to as simple a thing as when you're brushing your teeth in the morning, you fill your cup with water and you turn the tap off. That's an environmental issue. And every child over the age of, say, 5 is brushing teeth, for God's sake, one way or another, at least in the United States. So right there, you've done, and of course it may save, what, a pint of water per child per, month or something like that. But what's that got to do with the price of tea in China? If you multiplied that by thousands, you would start to see noticeable differences in the world. Also, that when they grew up, they wouldn't be taking long baths, they would be taking short showers. And instead of taking short showers, they would be taking stand-up half baths, right? Because now it's part of their consciousness is expending water is not the ideal thing to do if you want to preserve your home. But this is also true of art history museums, because every art history museum I know of preserves the historical record of how some human beings have viewed nature and depicted nature. And some of those people saw nature as something out there, separate from them. And other people saw themselves as an integral part of nature. That's an increasingly true statement about contemporary artists, many of whom are environmental activists, by the way. So every form of museum that you could think of is in a position to talk about that kind of thing. My favorite type that really ought to be doing the most are historic house museums. In the United States alone, there are 33,000 museums by rough count. And the largest single grouping of museums in the United States are historic house museums. And if you walk into an historic house museum, everything in that building can be used to talk about the environment. What were the building materials? Why was the building shaped the way it was? Some of those low ceilings are there for a reason, because we have high ceilings. It's hard to keep the place warm in the winter. Those ceilings are a big help. Small windows, harder to keep the place warm. You could go on and on about everything that the building and all of its contents can tell us about environmental history, and not just about the house in its particular place. Archaeologists are doing that all the time for buildings who are no longer visible on the surface of the earth, but they're uncovering these habitats below the surface of the earth and telling us why those particular habitats existed in the forms they existed, due to the responses to a particular local environment.
Yeah, wow, you said so much that I know Max was nodding along the same amount as I was. That's I'd agree. I thought about the different categories of museums and which would be easy to plug, like environmental justice and global warming things. And when I was thinking about the list, I thought, children's museums would be the most challenging. But, those small things, you're ingraining it at a young age and you're building into, ouch, our next generation that this is just normal, right? Like you're not having to learn it, or that scary change that we've talked about a couple of different times today. Um, but it's, this is just normal. You just turn off the water when you brush your teeth. I'd love to hear, Max, if there's anything you wanted to respond to what Avi said, or if you have a thought about the responsibility of museums or archaeology to talk about and share about the good, the bad, and the ugly of today's world and of the past.
Foremost, I think it comes back to even just habit building, but habit building comes from emulation, right? Like if most importantly, as Avi was saying, children learn from other people, and we as human beings learn from other human beings. And I think that there's something that I love most about archaeology, and something that always I think speaks to why we talk about what we talk about. It's because they were just effectively, we always say they're just like us, but it is true. Like human beings have responded to change and have had to respond to change for tens of thousands of years. We have had to keep adapting, and we have made we have made it to the point that we are at today by responding to change. And I think that there's almost something that we maybe somehow have along the way lost or wanted to lose about actually responding actively to change. We are very scared now of losing a status quo, of losing a particular set of kind of standards of perhaps of living, of normality. And we fear very greatly this kind of this need to adapt to a changing climate, and a climate that we are actively changing by not responding to those changes as well. So I think it's a responsibility as in the sense of to perpetuate, rather to communicate the way that human beings have changed and been changed by their environment, as a way of normalizing our need to have to change, to have to make changes independently and like socially to survive. And I think that as archaeologists, in the way that we communicate is also very important. Like we assume that people will know that people have had to change and have had to um, respond. But the way that we do that is also kind of not targeted, or not we don't do that in a very effective way sometimes. And I think that we hide it behind jargon, or we hide it behind kind of very esoteric language or cultural kind of phenomena. But realistically, that people have had to keep doing that. And I think that big part of what we do in communicating archaeology and in communicating heritage is to try and make that even those concepts accessible. And I actually think that through music, it's interestingly, for some reason, I always forget about children's museums. It's actually fascinating that was brought up, because I also kind of was like, children's museums, like that's certainly not something that I even thought about. But I think that even the way that we communicate um, archaeology to children, and the human adaptive response to children, actually is instrumental to the way that we then help people change the way that they view their environment, or rather than like the way that they view their place in their environment. And a huge part of that, as I said at the beginning, is also as rooted in Indigenous knowledge, is that it's to shift away from this kind of, I don't know, normalized us and us and the outside versus a very kind of interconnected relationship that was, for the most part, there for the majority of human history, that we've kind of lost, we've kind of shed. And I think that we need to get back to that.
I think I would toss in one other consideration, and that is that we suffer culturally from lag. There's a tremendous lag between the assumptions that we make about the world and the basic categories that we define, that is out of kilter with our current realities. We're still living with a paradigm that sees nature as something that we should have to control and dominate in order for humans to have better lives. And that's been a dominant paradigm for centuries now. The problem now is that we're in a position where we, in fact, do dominate nature, often to our own disruption and our own unhappiness. It's one thing when you are fighting nature, primeval nature, for sustenance on a day-to-day basis, and it's quite a different matter when you are engaged in consumer culture that proliferates luxury goods and vanity goods of every possible kind. And you look out the window and you can see that the weather is changing and climates are changing and the world is about to change in radical ways. There's a complete disconnect here that we really need to resolve. The nearest analogy I can think of, because it's so recent and so very quick, is the changes in digital technologies. I mean, 1 minute we were on the telephone I'm literally the telephone with a landline. And the next minute we're running around, every single one of us, with a cell phone in our hands. By the way, I mean, I take public transportation a lot, and it doesn't matter. I mean, these are people at every level of the socioeconomic structure, and every single person on that car has a cell phone in the hand. It's absolutely unbelievable. The speed with which the digital revolutions have taken place far exceed the time it takes us to adjust our cultural norms to set standards or ethics or define what's reasonable and what isn't reasonable on these things. And one of the results is we have, at this point, pretty close to an anarchic sea of information, disinformation, misinformation, and outright lies. And we have no standards whatsoever in our current situation for determining which one matters. It's all equal. And you know, the things were very different 20 years ago. We're not talking about, you know, ages and ages. We're talking about less than a lifetime. In a single generation, the world has totally transformed how we communicate. And that the norms of what, and the implications, and therefore what the norms and standards should be, not a clue. We're still back at the day when you had 3 television networks and you read the daily paper. And I mean, that's where our norms are, but that had no relevance to what's actually happening in the world today. Literally.
I'm curious, do you two think that previous generations, and let's say archaeologists and museum people 150 years ago, or even 50 years ago, do you think that these same debates were being had, or maybe just different topics, but the debates were still happening? Or is this something that is like just, it's come about, right? Like it's a modern phenomena? Either one of you can answer.
I think as long as we have had the modern public museum, there have been debates about what its purpose should be. And the answer that everybody keeps coming back to, using a different terminology every generation, is that the museum has to be useful to somebody. And, you know, John Cotton Dana said that 120 years ago. And Stephen Weil said that 40 years ago. And we're still saying it today. when we say we want to be relevant, we have to be, we want to be useful to somebody, to our communities. And how we define that utility or how we define that relevance is going to alter generation after generation because the particular circumstances will alter generation to generation. One of our problems as museums is that we are conventionally and traditionally and habitually, even worse, very slow. We're not fast institutions. And change is happening faster and faster. And our speed as a type of institution, a category of institution, has not materially increased. I think we're doing a little better in some of our online programming where we are keeping more or less pace. But that's not easy to do and still maintain a high level of quality and thoughtfulness. And in our traditional forms, exhibitions and traditional public programs and school programs, we're slow as molasses. Really.
Max, what do you think? Do you have any thoughts about debates? Do you think these are debates that have been happening with each generation? Do you think this is somehow uniquely just us in this moment?
I think to some capacity, each generation has some sort of debate about sustainability, but what that sustainability encompasses is just changes. I think sustainability in terms of as we put as an institution, the relevance and how sustainable is that relevance, but also then I think our understanding of what sustainability in itself it, culturally has shifted. So our sustainability now is how like the longevity of not just say an institution or a concept, but even just the sustainability of us as a species and our everything that surrounds us. So I think the debate is probably been around. I think maybe in like archaeologically, maybe probably 120 years ago, 150 years ago, the sustainability was kind of will we keep finding stuff to display, right? And so that informed a lot of museum collections. And I can certainly say that even in Australia, there's museum collections that are just collect literally just collections of stuff because it was the idea of well we have to keep people coming back. It remains relevant because it's exotic, because it's interesting. But then we have shifted that debate to well the sustainability of, as I said, the storage, but also the sustainability of what does that mean for other cultures, non-Western cultures, the cultures that were exploited by being called exotic and being collected, but then also the sustainability of how long can we keep even this practice of extracting objects and displaying them even going. And I think that is a debate that is that's constantly going to be shifting, and it will be shifting even just in the way that archaeologists practices for a lot of people is shifting away from practical as in excavational archaeology to digital archaeology to remote sensing to these kinds of aspects of non-invasive techniques, LiDAR rather than test trenches, that kind of thing, right? Even is just it's a huge conceptual shift and a huge technical shift, but also what does that mean also for sustainability of sites, but also sites, the environment of those sites, because we no longer necessarily have to excavate an entire site. Say in South America, we can map it, or in Cambodia we can map it. We don't actually have to go and extract anything, and we don't have to dismantle the ecosystem or just be destructive in our practice. So the debate, I think, has always been there. I just think and will continue to be there because I'm sure in 100 years, in 50 years, there's going to be, again, new technology and new techniques and new methods and approaches. But I think that, yeah, it's just that it's the nature of the debate. I think the tools of the debate rather that keep changing.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Yeah, absolutely. There's always going to be something to debate, right? If there's two people with two brains, there's going to be a debate because it's two different humans. It's interesting your comments about the tools used to actually like identify or find things or map them. I work in a lot of maritime realms, so I'm always surrounded by hurricanes and tsunamis, but also boats and lighthouses and things that the sea level rising like very intimately impacts. And I have colleagues that do underwater archaeology, and hearing their take and like their practices in when things get extracted from the water and when they don't, and the longevity and like the timeline it takes to actually remove something. Like it was a concept that I didn't understand, and they kept coming back to like sometimes it's better to leave it where it is. And as a museum person, it's like, but no, but I want to see it. It's like, but sometimes it is better where it is. It sounds very much like what you're saying, just in the water sense, not the terrestrial sense, that you don't have to disturb it. Like it is okay to leave it, which I think that in and of itself is kind of a radical thought that it was, collect everything, like you said, and ship it around the world. And now that's not necessarily the case, or like things get to be returned to where they should be or should have been kept instead of removed and put in other museums. I'm curious as we were, believe it or not, in the last 30 minutes of our time together. I'm curious, what kinds of challenges do you think really pushing these fields to kind of embrace the good, the bad, and the ugly? What kind of challenges do you see or have you seen? And maybe if on the flip side, like what kind of encouragements do you have that, like, we know that these roadblocks exist. How can, I don't know, how can you live through them, I guess, right? So like as museum professional, you don't always get like oh yeah, let's do that. I'm sure as an archaeologist, you don't get the immediate like that sounds like a great plan. Um, and so for these topics that definitely are or can become very politically charged, how like what are those hurdles that you've seen, and how can we get overcome those hurdles? And yeah, either one of you.
Oh, Avi, please. I'm actually very curious to hear your take.
Please, Max.
I'll try to be quick. But I think, and for me personally, this my personal view would be that the biggest challenges come from not being cognizant of who is affected and why they're affected. Um, in most archaeological practice, there is it's a destructive practice. It's a destructive science. Because we just said it's the removal, typically it is the removal of something to expose something else and to try and take that and to try and glean any information from it. So the biggest challenge is also almost trying to internally justify the destruction of something to get that information, and but also being really, really cognizant of why am I really trying to get that information? Who am I benefiting? Who is benefiting? And do those benefits really outweigh the cost of doing it? And then that can also mean even just intellectually in terms of the production of knowledge. Am I doing this for what reason? Why am I practicing a kind of a destructive science? And why am I going and traveling to a place? Why am I digging? Why am I removing objects? Why am I studying them? What story am I trying to tell? Whose story am I trying to tell? And realistically, like the challenge there becomes is that my ego of me trying to be a person who has a name on a paper, or am I trying to contribute to a deeper understanding of someone else's culture, um, someone else's life. Because I'm at the end of the day, that's what I am doing. That's my entire work. Is I'm digging up someone else's life and I'm trying to tell their story. But how do I tell that story respectfully, and how do I do that? And I think we really have to internalize just asking the question of why. Like, what is the purpose? Why am I doing this? And how can I actually mitigate the costs of that? Like in terms of um even just in the long term, is it will the heritage be useful, like in terms of like, will it be usefully displayed? Will it actually be accessible to the people whose heritage it is? Will they, like, will I actually be able to contribute to the story of the people that I am um, studying? I feel like it's a lot of questions. It's a lot of like really coming from an important, like, it has to be a very internalized place. I mean, that sounds a bit, maybe a bit utopian, a bit airy fairy, but like I think it comes from an intellectual space. The biggest challenge is always, I think, an intellectual one of why am I actually doing this? Like, what is the purpose of the research?
Thank you,
I think
Max.
that
Abby?
Max is pointing us to a really difficult shift for lots of organizations, that is shifting from dealing with people as the objects of our attention to being the subjects of their own history. And in order to do that, basically the challenge is, how can we, in our removed distance from those lives, whether there are other cultures within our own society, whether there are cultures from the distant past or cultures from faraway places. The trick is, how do we find a way to give those people's voice? And in other words, that they're not something we just look at, but there's something, they are people who speak for themselves. And that is a really complicated, difficult task. Often our sources are less complete than, or authentic than we would like them to be. In some cases, those voices have been overlaid by nostalgic interpretations that bear very little resemblance to the historical or archaeological reality of the thing. I mean, not everybody is out there with guns and whips doing the Indiana Jones piece. That's not quite how any of the archaeologists I know work, but those ideologies, those mythologies, filter the way in which we approach the problem. I grew up in history museums in particular, and of course for us it's really challenging business. Slavery, it's not, I don't think it's just a simple thing of showing this was good and this was bad. You have to show what it was in the context of its own time and how people rationalize their behaviors. And there are probably no behaviors where you couldn't find multiple opinions about the behaviors. It's not just people said this or people said that, and we're in disagreement, either yes or no. Often those dichotomies are shackles on our understanding. It may be that there were 5 different viewpoints that were important, and one of them, by the accidents of history, survived. And that becomes the dominant ideology, but it's not necessarily the appropriate one. So all this comes back to the business of touching on people's belief systems, and people will believe all kinds of wonderful things. The only people I've discovered who have real trouble following the Queen of Hearts dictum, I can think of 4 impossible things before breakfast or whatever she said, are museum people. They seem to have more trouble doing that than anybody else I know. But the truth is, we ought to be walking into our jobs every morning and think, what's something impossible that nobody believes could possibly happen inside our institution or at the behest of our institution that we could make happen. And the truth is that you can do all kinds of strange and wonderful things in museums with not so much effort. It is true that there are board governance rules that obtain and donor power. These are very critical business to the survival of most of our institutions. But museums tend to be very porous institutions, and people get away with absolute murder in museums. Uh, and if you because there's so much looseness in these structures, we pride ourselves that we have this great jargon and terminology about museums, mostly, by the way, related to collections. But in terms of actual structure of museums, there's a tremendous amount of flexibility. And people can do all kinds of things and get away with it, either because they have power that they're not exercising. In very small museums, for example, you have 2 or 3 staff. So one of the 3 staff says, I want to do this. Well, hell, they're going to get away with it because the other 2 people aren't going to fight them about it. And in big places, there often are holes, it's like Swiss cheese. There's a lot of holes you can burrow into and do your thing. And tunnel your way out another side without anybody even noticing, let alone complaining about it or objecting to it. And the truth is that most of our institutions are very anxious about criticism. We're almost, not quite, we're almost as bad as professional politicians. We like to think that we're electing courageous, powerful people to public office. And I worked at one point for a US senator, and 2 constituents sent in a letter. In those days, they actually wrote letters. Sent in a letter complaining about something. It was like the earth had collapsed around us, 2 people. There's a guy who was winning election by 10,000, 50,000 votes, and he's worried about 2 constituents writing letters, right? They're afraid of their own shadows. We mostly are people who just get nervous when they hear criticism. Museums are very much in that same boat, not quite as bad as politicians. But somebody writes a letter to the chair of the board and says, something was out of whack. And it's like, oh my God, the sky is falling. And God forbid you write back a letter and say, yeah, that's what happened.
That's so true. I love that analogy with elected officials. That is, I would agree, definitely. I'm going to pause to give space to Ibrahim, to Fadi. So if you'd like to pop on, we'd love to welcome you. I want to say thank you both to Max and Abby, myself. Thank you for having this conversation. I know Ibrahim will also echo that. But I've really enjoyed this chat. It's made me very invigorated.
Thank you. And I was really enjoying hearing Avi and Max. And before that, I was hearing all other speakers. Like, yes, since the start of this event, listening and enjoying really well. I'm ecstatic. I'm ecstatic. Like the point where Avi ended his argument. Like, yeah, I was enjoying like listening to something like an audiobook. Like really he alive his experiences, and he has a rich knowledge about museum world. And yeah, I love the point like analogies he made about the knowledge of related to, I mean, new museum world. And it's quite easy to understand for those who are not from the field. Like I myself is from basically like archaeologist and dealing with the museum and things like that, and working with Safe Culture Heritage Group. It's been 8 years. And I used to talk with different uh, people around the world from different nationalities, and like rules and regulations. Like Rebecca was talking about something licensing, a legacy of colonialism in the practice of archaeology. And it's the same thing with the museum. Like we do have the same thing, but the Britons have moved on. But the legacies are still there, those who have been victims of those things. And the same thing is happening with the museums and their exhibitions, and like telephone and landline, like and cell phone, and more and more like rings, smart rings. And the same thing. I think we know all, maybe I'm not. There is another museum is coming up by the end of the next year, Data Land, and that would be a kind of by an artist in Los Angeles. Yeah, uh, Data Land, the name of the museum, and it would be based on something like I'm not sure what they would be exhibiting or what it would be, but it would be a kind of thing like about artificial intelligence. That's the new, uh, craze of human being, AI. And AI, yes, all are interested. And it's something like museums, yeah, they are improving, and there, yes, they are struggling with the things like a kind of resistance. As I have mentioned about like licensing and rules and regulation, they are the things of the walls against this museum system to move on or break, a kind of jail to go out and enjoy the world of nature. So they are in like a boundary, and they have to stay because sometimes, yes, it's obvious. And an archaeologist who used to work at the field and to keep things very locked up under the security and checks up. And the same thing is happening with the museum like go downs. They still don't consider themselves as an institutions. Primarily, every institutions define museums like a kind of uh, what we say an institution, obviously, to educate the community and people. But we haven't reached that point still. We are thinking it's a kind of building who house the antiquities, maybe paintings, art museums. And still, when we define something like food museum, AI museum, and we consider something would be coming up about ruins of those things that would be displayed there. And that's the concept is really, uh, yeah, somewhere is changing and somewhere is still inside those restrictions. And I'm happy that people are sharing something that we are always thinking, and we do like to speak about the same thing. Like SCAG is about the same idea. Like we don't want those things like okay, you don't need to speak about this subject or this field because you're not from this relevant field, or you don't have specific research methodologies. Obviously, that's a hard job, and only academician can do. But something like someone also know about the museum because he have visited, and it can be them experiences and their experiences, and they can talk about those things. And such platforms need to be invented, maybe, like more and more. Like we need to talk about things that make museums a better uh, something that we can say kind of an institution who present the past to the future generations. And we are still looking at the present, and the things are from the past, and we don't know about the future. So, yes, that's the museum we have in our prestigious institutions. But yes, some of the very good museums we do have and we have seen in the world. Um, I don't want to be that professional politician. Thank you so much. I think we can hear from some of our attendees if they have some chats or something like that. And how much time we have left for the next session?
We've got about, looks like 12 minutes before the closing and thanks. We're supposed to kick off.
I want to, not ask, but I would like to, I would like Avi to add something like, as his experiences, and I have seen his like bio and his work with the related with the communities, who are not like in a majority of in a nation or in a world or in the states. And I think he has been very experienced in this kind of field, like especially from the museum perspective, like how you would be defining yeah, we are listening in the academia and in everywhere, like decolonizations of museum world. And I was hearing some of the news, I think a day before from British news channel, maybe, yes, British broadcasting. And it was about something like it was the repatriations and I think looting of the antiquities from the African world to the yes, I don't know where they bring those antiquities and things like that. But I want to precisely ask something like how better we can present museums inclusively to everyone, like we are accepting everyone around the world, like especially maybe decades ago before us, it was not the situation for some communities to be represented uh, that way that they are being represented with the advantage of with the advent of these social media things, technologies we do have, because everyone can come up and they can speak and they can share about their own communities or things that were not maybe allowed or restricted before. So please.
Well, you mentioned repatriation. Talk about a tough one for museums today. I don't believe that there has been a single week in the last 2 or 3 years when a major news story has not broken about some aspect about repatriation issues. And it does seem to me that one of the fundamentals of human history and culture in general has been cultural exchange. We don't know of any group that I know of at least that has been so totally isolated that it has absolutely no communication or exchange with another culture anywhere in the world. So we see there are, for example, in art museums, there are very good reasons for displaying the art of a whole variety of cultures and a variety of communities. To do that, you've got to have the art that you can display side by side so that you can see what's going on in that conversation, that discourse. On the other hand, there's absolutely no, it seems to me, and I'm an innocent and naive person about this for sure, that just because a nation owns or claims ownership of certain pieces of art doesn't mean that they couldn't own the art and loan it back for particular purposes. We do international, I mean, every major art show I've seen in recent years involves loans that are traveling from one institution to another in order to help them tell the story. So I do think that a lot of the Western European nations and the United States in particular, who have aggrandized themselves at the expense of other cultures around the world for several centuries now, could not repatriate a lot of their collections and still maintain viable exhibition and interpretive programs. But it's just going to involve a little more intense negotiations for loan periods and the like in order to make the case. But the British Museum managed in one fiasco to undercut all of the rhetoric about universal museums and why you needed to have them. It turned, we not only are universal, but we preserve the culture and heritage of all of mankind. And then it turns out that, by the way, except when we lose stuff to pilferers on our own staffs. And as soon as you get to that point of total institutional irresponsibility, your argument is gone. You no longer have the high ground in this kind of thing at all. So I do think we're going to see new forms of exchange among museums. That's actually, if I had to single out the thing that's most likely to happen, that's going to have the greatest effect in the shortest amount of time, is we're going to see museums stop behaving as if they were institutional isolates and do a lot more partnering, not only with other museums, but with all kinds of other organizations who bring skill sets to the table that museums do not have at all. There's a growing demand in the United States for sure, and I think other countries as well, for museums to tackle difficult contemporary conversations. And the problem, and museums themselves say this is something we should be doing. And the problem is they don't have no idea how to do it. I mean, I know that sounds absurd, but it's actually true. We do not know how to convene difficult community conversations in our museums. So we're going to have to either develop a whole new skill set or partner with people who actually do have those skills. Pretty simple understanding. But I think that the idea of intensified collaboration and partnership across time and space will be a wonderful opportunity for all museums and for the communities that they serve alike.
Yeah, that's good. That's lovely, and I think Katie also, because she had an experience being in a museum, and we are having something like related. It's a kind of something that, yeah, maybe it can be, but you find better. Uh, I want to say about the things going on, like it's an, I mean, a cause to protect I mean, this globe or Earth, global warming, climate change. But the protests being happen to attack those who, I mean, working for the museums. Maybe you have seen a note last week from the museum associations about the workers being attacked by the climate change activists. And I think, yeah, it's my personal opinion. Don't consider it as CHG or whatever it is, but I think it can be better represented by doing something alternative. We don't know. I don't know what you can do or what how they can do that better. Uh, but what happening is doing something like creating insensitivity of these cultural institutions among those who are not from the field or background like us, like myself, taking antiquities from the art, handing it over to you, and you are making them a kind of preserve items and making them possible to exhibit others. And for those who are like maybe not very sensitive about the heritage or past or things like that, when such thing happens, they would be very insensitive, and it would they would be considering something like it's not something that we need to for our country or for our culture, and we can live without that. And it's that like in a war-torn countries, like we can see in the Middle East, because that's the region all the time wars going on, and in that region we do have the Mesopotamian, Babylonians, and these are the remains like sites. And but when the sites are being damaged or being looted, what we say, trafficking of cultural properties, I mean, items, or things like that. And how can be museum can be protected in those regions? But to those regions in the world having peace or prosperity, and when they are having such kind of, events, and those like working and protecting those items or preserving them and can be being attacked by these kind of activities, I think they will feel like I mean very down. Like it could be something like for the newcomers or the beginners. I don't know. I don't need to go there because basically we all know that being archaeologist, like I know, it's a very low paid skilled labor in the world, around the world. It's the same happening in academia also because we lag behind because we borrow our what we say academics tools and techniques, research techniques from other fields, and other fields consider as something like that's not needed. We can continue without that. So, so I think it can continue, and if these kind of activism can continue affecting museums, especially and cultural properties, uh, that would be very bad. Like I think Katy would can explain better because she is working in the museum, and Yeah, we can't suggest what can be best, but yes, this is we do know that this is something that is affecting badly, like throwing some liquid on the very precious items. Yeah, that can attract very, I mean, so news around the world, big news headlines, but that item is being considered something like very not important. So, what do you say?
I I I don't know if I have any answers. I have no answers for this. I think I I've experienced some like response to it. It's been more in response to like exhibits going up that people don't agree with, rather than like um, the museum being like a target, or like some like activists coming to the museum. And that might be because the museums that I've worked at haven't taken a bold step one way or another. They kind of really, like Abby said, they played that politician role. It's let me stay in the middle grounds. Um, the from what I've seen, and this is mostly in like the American Southeast, where I used to live and work, or the Pacific Northwest, where I currently live and work. People don't like the disruption from the one homogenous story, and um, it's because the museums that I've seen really don't take a firm stand. Um, it's just kind of like you just kind of float along. Um, but I mean, I've definitely heard of museums that have gotten harsh pushback, but it's usually about like queer communities being exhibited, or promoting indigenous voices versus the kind of the very typical US kind of white male middle class Christian married with two kids kind of thought process. I know that there's definitely been times in my career that I've thought like I'm not necessarily like not going to come back to a museum. I'm not sure how this reaction's going to go. Um, but I know that I am very much privileged in that hasn't been a concern, like a safety concern for me. Um, but I think about the countries that are in active war zones, and like the news coverage of what's happening. And um, I do think about museums and like that cultural heritage, but ultimately it's like there's people there. There's people that are stuck and not like they don't want to be in the middle of this, right? Like it's not necessarily something that they want to handle. And so I don't know. I think about, historically wartime has destroyed those like pillars of community, which often revolve around like those cultural centers. And that's a lot of museums and monuments and churches of some kind, or mosques, or um, I think it's especially disheartening when wartime um, goes in that direction, where it's like let's just demolish all morality. Um, but I do think that museums have a reason to state these things, right? Like I think a lot of times in the U.S., at least, the response is like, well, it's not our country. So some of those um, Russian conflicts and like the war in Ukraine, like these are things that in the US it's always like, well, that's not us. We don't need to talk about it. But it's also like we don't want to talk about what's happening here either, right? Like what Abby and I were talking about with like the political unrest, and and circling back to we're in a presidential election cycle, and it's, again, we don't take sides on politics, and that's, you know, very interesting because everybody has an opinion, and it's more so just like mum's the word, right? Like don't comment on it very much. It's like what Max was saying with us and nature. It's like us and then them all the way over there. Like we don't we're not actually together, but we're all living in the same space. Which I don't know if any of that answered where you were thinking I would go with that answer. I do want to be mindful of time. So we are at our closing and our thanks. So I will once again say thank you to Avi and Max for co-chatting with me about museums and archaeology and nature and culture. And Avi and I exchanged emails, and yeah, of course we can chat for hours on end about this, and very easily filled our hour and a half. I want to say that this session in particular really aligns with Museum Week. Museum Week is 1 week in June. That is a global celebration, both in person and online, and it always centers around nature and culture. So check them out on social media. There's also Museum Week magazine and lots of ways to interact with them and their initiatives. Both Ibrahim and I also help out with that initiative as well, which is how we met. So I'm gonna turn it back to Max. Thank you for being on as a moderator, as a panelist, as dropping links in the chat and making sure the timings were right. Thank you. I appreciate it.
The thanks I have to extend to you, Katie. Genuinely, you have been an absolute powerhouse today. You have done an amazing job, really a phenomenal job, and I cannot thank you enough. Thank you to everyone that's been involved. I want to circle back to something because you talk about encouragements. You said something very important. I think we both kind of, Avi and I, maybe missed that, the encouragements of maybe these kinds of discussions. And I think that the encouraging thing of this discussion, and you really epitomize it as well in your presentation, in your talk, and in this engagement, is that this conversation is happening. Everything that you just said, your last answer, like the fact that we are having this conversation, the fact that we have I don't know how many time zones are currently in this Zoom meeting. It's the fact that it is happening at all, that it is absolutely phenomenal, and it's constructive, it's productive, it's encouraging, it's inspiring, and it's so important. And this is why we do it. And I think that there are certainly so many challenges, and we can talk about challenges until the cows come home. There are so many things that are so upsetting or negative, but I think that the fact that we can sit here and have these conversations and go off and talk to other people about these things is part of why we do this, right? It's part of why the whole point. And so I cannot thank you enough, Katie. I cannot thank Avi enough, Fadi enough as well, for everyone involved in today. This is why we do it. This is why we do it, to keep the conversation going. So I would like to, on behalf of the team at Safe Cultural Heritage Group, thank everyone involved. Extend our gratitude to every participant, every person who presented, and every single attendee. And for me, it's no longer International Archaeology Day, but it still is for most of you. So I thank you for celebrating this day with us, and creating the space and curating the space for these conversations. And these, I'm sure, will be a lot of thoughts going through a lot of heads, and that's exactly what we want. So we will say goodbye. I do want to say that if you'd like to get involved with SCHG, please reach out to us. We really want more people to be involved, and so please engage with us, email us, talk to us on LinkedIn, subscribe to the YouTube channel. I personally would love to see more panel discussions. I think this was such a such a productive, such a beautiful beautiful time spent. So I would love to promote more of these events as well, like genuinely just having more kind of just panel discussions, having more thought-provoking comments, and let people run with them. I think that always has really good results and really great outcomes. So without much more delay, I thank you all so sincerely. I wish you all a wonderful rest of the day, and yeah, thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your efforts. Thank you for your energy. And we hope to see you again next year for season 4.
Thank you. And I would like to add more. Yes, thanks to every speaker who have been here, every attendee who have been with us for the last 7 hours. Yes, and we are here about, it's middle of the night, 1 a.m. here, and morning coming to Kathy now. It's quite long. We have been here, and I want to say thanks to every speaker. And yeah, they have shared very valuable knowledge with us, insights, and that would be available for you all in shape of recordings. And I would not let you go without hearing Kathy, our partner, Learner Center Strategies. And I'm really thankful to her for being with us and continuing this journey, like she has been involved with us in the past event. And this ArchTalk would not be possible without her partnership. And the second would be Kiradar Ghar Studio from Zareen Gold, and Museum Week Benjamin, head of the Museum Week team. Thank you so much for partnering with us for ArchTalk 3.0. And we would love to see everyone coming up next, ArchTalk 4.0, and so many more. Like we're planning, and Max is working on some new events. And yeah, I would like all to hear about LCS, what LCS is, and how Kathy started it. And yeah, we would like to follow all those partners, social media, because they are the one who are standing by us and presenting everything what we have today. Thank you so much to all of you.
Great.
Please, Kathy.
Thank you, Ray, for the opportunity to join in the conversation. Very much appreciated.
Yes, we loved having you, Avi. It was delightful to chat. So when Max introduced me at the beginning of the first session, she shared my bio. So just very briefly, learner-centered strategies. I started a year and a half ago with the intent of making learning spaces inclusive and accessible for all ages and all abilities. So I have a very deep passion for making sure that all people are seen and felt safe in learning, in whatever that looks like, whatever learning space it is. I happen to work in museums now, but I've been in schools and in an aquarium. So I am on LinkedIn and Instagram as that consulting business. I'd love to connect and continue this conversation offline. I think a lot of what we talked about today definitely is centered in inclusion and in making sure that everybody is feeling heard and is given their due respect and their moment. So yes, I truly love moderating these sessions. I get so much out of them. So thank you for including me. And I look forward to season 4 and Museum Week and all of you online.
Signing off. Goodbye to everyone. Bye-bye. See you in next year, 2025.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.